This is the How to Write Funny podcast. I'm Scott Dickers. Today I chat with Kurt Luchs, the founder and editor of the literary humor site, The Big Jewel. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing now in comedy, your website and stuff like that.
The comedy enterprise that I've been involved in for the last 13 years continuously is my literary humor site, thebigjewel.com, which is one of a number that have been out there, not a huge number. There's a huge number of comedy sites, but there haven't been all that many literary humor sites, and there haven't been that many that have lasted any length of time.
And a lot of them are doing kind of the onion shtick. They're doing fake news.
Yeah, well, see, then I class them in a different category. They're comedy. I'm making probably a false distinction between comedy and humor, but to me, comedy is more in the moment. It's more topical. It's more disposable. I think of humor in prose humor as something that was built to last a little longer. And there's always some of it going on, and it does last a little longer. I don't know how long, but it's never the most popular form of humor out there, whatever the medium is at the moment that's pushing humor.
Yeah, and you use the word literary too, which is interesting because obviously both use writing, but there is something more writerly about certain types of, highbrow humor as opposed to comedy. These all seem like very arbitrary, subjective distinctions or judgments, but they totally fit. Like, I know exactly what you're talking about. Like Shouts and Murmurs is literary.
The New Yorker is probably the gold standard of the kind of humor that we try to publish.
And you have been published in that.
I have. McSweeney's Internet Tendency is another, and is probably the most direct inspiration for The Big Jewel. And The Onion falls into that category, although it's a much more commercial enterprise than McSweeney's, at least the McSweeney's humor site, because unlike all of its imitators, The Onion has a point of view and it has literary standards.
Yeah, but I think I'm with you. I would not call it literary humor. I would call it comedy for whatever reason. I don't know why.
Well, to me,
sometimes it is, I guess.
To me, one distinction is it still funny 10 or 20 years later? And so the best of The Onion, I think that's true. And if I look back to the humor of the last century or century and a half that's most influenced me, and most of that has come from The New Yorker, is James Thurber still alive? Robert Benchley, S.J. Perlman. That's the first generation, Dorothy Parker, others in that generation. And then the second generation, which was basically Woody Allen, Garrison Keillor, Ian Frazier, Veronica Gang, and up to some that are writing now. Jack Handy and is around and doing good work.
Yeah, so the interesting distinction there, I think, is, yes, some comedy survives, like even very lowbrow comedy survives.
Example. I'm putting you on the spot.
Jack Benny is probably a good example of very popular lowbrow comedy entertainment.
Yes.
It's still funny.
I think it is, yes.
And it's primarily because it's character-based. But I think the distinction here is the audience. Literary humor is going after a more intellectual audience, right?
Right.
Who isn't really going to be as interested in the easy joke or the broad joke.
Hopefully,
that might be more the purview of comedy per se, right?
And it's not this distinction I'm making, which is probably a false and very subjective distinction, but I do make it nonetheless.
I think it's a worthy distinction. It's just interesting to dig into what it really means.
You don't want to get lost in the weeds on it, but it doesn't mean that I don't like comedy, and it doesn't mean that I don't value comedy. I just see them as different things. And being raised on The New Yorker by my parents, among other things, among other influences, that was the place where anybody with any intellectual aspirations went for their knowledge of contemporary literature and cartoons and humor and everything else, journalism.
Yeah, even culture and current events, right?
Yeah, and there is no touchstone like that in the world today, and that's one of the things that has changed. But The New Yorker is still there, and it's still in the humor category is a gold standard of humor.
Yep.
The household I grew up in was strange, and it was permeated by humor and comedy, both to a level that I didn't realize at the time was unusual. So
Tell us about that. Like,
well, among other things, my parents were both Anglophiles. So that meant we not only paid a lot of attention to every BBC program that was on PBS, which did exist at the time, but all of the British comedians. So going back to an audio program of the 50s, The Goon Show.
sure.
Spike Milligan, the main creator, Peter Sellers and Harry Seacombe, actors on that program. I was raised on that, and being a kid, I didn't know that everybody wasn't. I didn't know that I was the only person in my school who knew about this. And everything that came after that, the Beyond the Fringe troupe.
Python, obviously.
Well, Peter Cook and Dudley Moore, who came out of Fringe, and then
Right.
Python that kind of emerged after that.
They were just greatly influenced, but yeah, I don't think they had a direct connection with the Goon Show.
Not directly, no. But they put Spike Milligan in their movies to acknowledge their debt to him.
Sure.
He's got a bit part, I think, in Life of Brian. And all of that on the British side. And on the American side, the New Yorker, all of those humorists, and also a lot of spoken word comedy albums, but maybe a little left of center, like Lenny Bruce and Shelley Berman. And Second City had comedy albums in the early 60s. And not many people even know that, but
I did not know that.
we had them. They were in our house.
Ah,
We had an album by Mal Sharp and Jim Coyle called The Absurd Imposters, which was an early street put-on interview album. And
I know the committee was doing stuff like that. I've heard some of their.
the committee had at least one album. We had that, all this stuff. And then later on in the 60s, it was the Firesign Theater.
Right.
And that
Were you into those guys at all?
well, they were personal heroes and mentors of mine.
In what way?
It was probably their stuff that got me most interested in doing comedy humor creatively.
Was it just because of the production value, or was it more like, because you're a little bit younger than their generation?
Yeah, it's a younger
maybe-
generation, and they were then at the beginning, and then to go into the peak of their career. But what they were doing in the recording studio with humor, this multi-layered, very produced, very intricate, with many jokes, so many that you couldn't get them all the first time.
Yeah, it was like the Beatles or
The Beatles
Pink
of-
Floyd of comedy.
The Beatles of comedy is a term that has been applied to them, and it's fair. And being
Except
big,
that they were American.
except that they were American. Right?
I always think of Python as the Beatles of comedy because they came here from England and really changed comedy. But Firesign
That's true.
Theater, at least in the way of taking intricate production value and really treating it as an art, the way the Beatles did pop music, you can definitely apply that to the Firesign Theater.
And growing up in the 60s and growing up with the Beatles and being very excited to see this leap in evolution from one single to the next, from one album to the next, and just the level of creativity that was suddenly available in a realm that hadn't been overflowing with it. And then all of the things that came out of that. And then to see that done with humor, humor was always much bigger in our house than music. My parents really didn't know much about music. And the music that they had was kind of humorous. I mean, they had these early what today would be called world music albums. So, we'd have, folk songs of New Guinea and other stuff that might have had an ethnographic value or whatever. But for us, this stuff was just very funny. We were surrounded by bizarre shards of culture from all over the world.
Did they do a lot of the, like, Tom Lehrer sort of political comedy music and stuff?
Tom Lehrer was a staple in the household. I can still recite the old Dope Peddler from verbatim.
Wow.
Peter Cook's Misty Mr. Whisty album.
I don't know that one.
Well, it's great. He's a vote for E.L. Whisty and lovely nude ladies will come and dance with you. I know that record art by heart.
Wow.
And this was the milieu we were raised in, and also just tons of books, modern poetry, modern literature. And the interesting thing was, with all this media in the house, as we would call it today, nothing was forbidden. I could read anything. I could read Henry Miller if I wanted, at any age. I could read. anything that was on their shelf.
I wish more parents knew that that's a good thing unilaterally.
I think it was good for me. I mean,
Totally.
I was curious and I loved it. I just bathed in all that stuff. And I didn't realize to what extent it had shaped my view of what's interesting and what I might want to do. But in some ways, I kind of followed both my parents. My mom was more literary in nature and more interested in poetry. She used to go around the house reciting Yeats and Frost and Dylan Thomas, and that kind of gets into a guy's head
Sure.
at an early age. So there was this spoken word culture that was very powerful. And my dad was the comedy guy.
And what did they do for a living?
Well, she was a housewife with 7 children that she had in a space of 10 years.
Oof.
So what she mainly did for a living was postpartum depression.
Yeah.
My dad was one of the original Mad Men. He worked for the Leo Burnett Agency in downtown Chicago, and then eventually other agencies like they all do.
Is he still with us?
He is not. He left this world in 2010.
Had Mad Men started by that point?
It had, and
Did he have an opinion about it?
He was a huge fan because it's a totally accurate show, and he was there and he lived it and he knew. And that was the kind of household we grew up in, where at that time, of course, today there are all kinds of corporate cultures, and many of them are very inviting and intentionally diverse. But at the time, ad agencies were just about the only professional jobs you could get that had that kind of culture.
Right, but was he in a creative or like a sales?
He was a copywriter.
Okay. The most creative position
Right.
at such a place.
He had started his life as a cartoonist and probably would have liked to have done that. So he had an interest in both things. He taught us how to draw. In some respects, he taught us how to write.
Wow, so you really were steeped in it. And it's interesting, all the examples you mentioned are all literary humor, even the albums. There's not a lot of comedy in there. Like, I didn't hear anything about early TV. I didn't hear even Albert Brooks or...
He was a fan of Sid Caesar and Your Show of Shows. In fact, all but one of the children in our family were born at home, and I think it was my brother Helmut. It might have been my brother Rolf. I can't remember. Anyway, someone corrected me before. I thought it was Helmut, but apparently it wasn't. Anyway, my mom was in labor and having the child in the bathtub, and Sid Caesar was on, and he wouldn't come and help her until the show was over. So comedy was hardcore. Yeah.
Wow. So let me ask you this then. Are you the only of the children who kind of went into this sphere?
No. When we were in our teens and early 20s, we formed a sibling comedy troupe called the Luchs Brothers, which originally, like the Marx Brothers, included all 4 of us, and eventually, like the Luchs Brothers, only included the eldest 3.
Wait, the other siblings were girls? Was that how that worked?
There were 4 boys and 3 girls.
Okay.
And for some reason, we didn't think of it as a Van Trapp or Von Trapp family thing.
Von Trapp?
Von Trapp, okay.
Von Trapp? I don't know. Whatever.
It's been a while since I saw it.
Yes, indeed. So, and then you guys did performance, like on a little makeshift stage, or did you just do the audio recordings, or did you write?
Well, eventually we focused almost entirely on writing, but we started out doing writing and performing sketch comedy.
And how old did you start doing that?
Let's see, I would have been like 21. Okay. And so my youngest sibling at that time was 14.
You were the oldest?
The oldest boy.
Okay.
Got an older sister.
Got it.
7 of us altogether. And we did that for about half a dozen years and performed pretty widely in the Midwest, did coffee houses, universities. That was how we ended up meeting the Firesign Theater, because we went and performed at events of theirs and became friends with them. And eventually when the Luchs Brothers had a humor column, and eventually when that was collected into a book, David Osman of Firesign Theater wrote the introduction. Great. And we got Gay and Wilson of the New Yorker to do a great full-color cartoon for the cover.
Wow. When
but
you were like in your early to mid-20s.
That came a little later, yeah.
Oh, okay.
We performed, it was exclusively live performance for a couple of years, and then my dad made a trip to England and came back with a clutch of records, which included stuff like Orgasm Addict by the Buzzcocks. But he also brought back the earliest Sex Pistols records. And when I heard Johnny Rotten, it was like an epiphany. And I immediately sat down and wrote a 10-minute, in 10 minutes, wrote a parody of Johnny Rotten called Kill Me, I'm Rotten. We recorded that with our producer. We were working in a studio by then. And
Yeah, I was going to ask how you got hooked up, because the production value of the Luchs Brothers stuff is pretty good. It's not what you would think of as kids at home.
No, it was our own home-based studio, but it was a real studio, and we recorded other acts, some of whom have gone on to do relatively well. In particular, a guy named Studebaker John, who's a Chicago blues guy who's very big, especially in Europe, and his first album is with us, and nobody even knows about it.
So it was a recording studio where you guys recorded music, comedy, whatever, and you had it
Mostly
it was
our own
available
stuff.
for hire.
Yes, mostly our own stuff, but to help pay the bills. We actually rented a studio and we had equipment. Kill Me, I'm Rotten was done on a 4-track, but after that
Reel
we
to
got
reel 4-track.
a TAC 4-track, and
Yeah, I
then we
remember
eventually
those.
got a TAC Tascam 8-track, and that's where most of our stuff was recorded.
Half inch or 1 inch.
The Tascam was a 1-inch.
So the fancy stuff, the good stuff.
Yeah, and then even that we took to bigger studios and put on 16 or 24 track and
Wow.
mixed, and some of our more elaborate stuff had to be done that way because it was just too much stuff in it.
Right. You can only bounce tracks so many times.
Right. We really didn't like bouncing, although it worked for the Beatles pretty well.
Yeah, you can get away with it.
Yeah.
I just don't recommend it on cassette multi-track.
No.
That's never a good idea.
Except for a demo. It's okay for a demo.
Yeah.
So we were recording by then. We released that song and a very different kind of non-punk song on the flip side, so people wouldn't mistake us for a punk band, but they did anyway. And that record actually did pretty well. It was picked up by Bomp Records, a distributor at that time. It sold, I think, about 4,000 copies in Europe and maybe half that in the U.S., and got played on Dr. Demento, and it got reviewed a lot.
It's great.
For whatever reason. I mean, maybe just because it was an actual parody of the Sex Pistols, which nobody else had done. So.
And this predates Weird Al, I would imagine, by a few years.
Right, and unlike most of Al's stuff, we didn't really understand how song parodies are supposed to be done. We thought that you wrote your own tune and you just made it sound like the other guy. You
Right.
didn't actually take their tune and write your own lyrics to it,
Right.
which I learned later was the proper way to do a song parody.
Yeah, no, he definitely upgraded that.
But even he still does his own songs.
Oh,
and
no, of course.
And those are generic
and some are
parodies.
inspired by other bands.
Yeah, yeah.
So he
So-
does do that.
He does both ways, but his
Yep.
big hits are usually the actual parodies.
Right.
So that kind of led to other things. That and having a studio led to us recording radio commercials, which we quickly discovered was just about the only way you could actually make money with comedy, audio comedy, in this country.
In many ways, it's the only way you can make money with a recording studio.
In many
Because-
ways.
Bands don't have money usually.
No.
If you're small, so it's a
No.
good way to keep the lights on in the studio.
Yeah, and that was interesting. We got a fair amount of that work.
And it's at your studio, right? It's not you guys being hired out as voice talent or writers to go to other studios to record the commercials.
Nobody would have really hired us as voice talent.
Okay.
I think we were pretty good doing our own stuff, but as performers, we were kind of a triple non-threat. We couldn't sing, we couldn't dance, and we couldn't act.
Okay.
So we didn't have our own material. I think we could interpret. It's kind of like Leonard Cohen. You wouldn't hire him to sing someone else's song. But it led to a lot of other things. You make a lot of discoveries sometimes doing things for a commercial reason and solving those creative problems, how to make something funny in 60 seconds and sell a product. And it was, what I found was no matter what we did, we learned something from it and had fun with it and hopefully made something entertaining.
Now, were you guys making a living doing this in your 20s, or did you have other jobs?
Oh, God, no. We always worked. A variety of jobs. My brother Helmut ended up being in lighting and gaffing and film, and he still does that, works a lot in this town.
Yeah,
Has
because
worked-
you were in Chicago at the time, and there was a fair amount of work.
Wheaton, Illinois.
Okay, so yeah.
We grew up in the same town as the Belushi brothers.
Yeah.
They went to Wheaton Central, we went to Wheaton North. Also, they were older than us, so we didn't really know them. Although I saw a production of West Side Story with Jim in it that was pretty good at Wheaton Central. So yeah, we were doing, and I was working mostly editorial jobs, writing an editorial, and that ended up publishing being my career until I ended up getting into television later.
What kind of career in publishing does one find in Chicago in the 70s?
Mostly trade publishing. So it's working for, the American Hospital Association and their magazines, and which was a pretty good gig, actually. Occasionally a book publisher. I edited something called Speechwriters Newsletter, which taught people in Washington how to write speeches, for which I really don't wish to take the blame, but we did that. A lot of gigs like that. I did spend a lot of the 80s at a place called the Institute of Soviet and East European Studies, which was a human rights organization trying to get political prisoners released out of the Soviet Union then, the then Soviet bloc.
Right, right.
So I would read about torture all morning and then write about it all afternoon, which was a very funny kind of experience for a comedy writer to have.
And then I assume that, like many comedy writers, you turned that into humor by commenting on it, turning your work into satire.
Not directly, but to say that most of our stuff tended to have a darker edge to it, tended to be a lot about pain. But most of that didn't come from reading about torture in the Soviet bloc. Most of it came from my parents' tortured marriage.
Well, yeah, so up until this point, it sounded like a pretty, Willy Wonka family home.
I was telling you the good stuff.
Yeah, but most comedy writers do have some pain back there somewhere. So they, I'm assuming, had sort of the typical marriage with a lot of kids. They don't communicate, things break down, and they should split up but don't.
It was about the size of it. It was extremely dysfunctional. We went to sleep every night listening to the sound of our parents arguing. So that was our only concept of what marriage was. And they did not break up until I was an adult, long after it would have mattered. Uh-huh. Not that I'm sure that would have improved life, but I kind of liken it to growing up inside a play, inside a novel, and the play is Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and the novel is The Lord of the Flies. So the marriage is the bad marriage is at the heart of it, but we were like kids on a desert island stranded and made our own little tribe.
Right.
And yes, animals and humans were slaughtered.
And
people died.
Clearly the comedy was kind of a way to survive that.
It kind of was. It was kind of a lifeline. And not doing it so much, but just enjoying it as a listener and a reader in the early years, and then later realizing that it was sort of purging and sort of healing to deal with some of that stuff in a comedic way.
It's sort of like the Wolf Boys. I know they're sort of a thing now. Somebody made a documentary about these boys who...
Raised by wolves, were they?
They were raised by TV, and their parents didn't let them leave the house. Do you know these guys?
It sounds familiar.
Brothers in the New York area.
I don't know.
It does sound... You'll have to look them up. I wish I could remember the name of the documentary or what they call that group, but it's something about wolves. And
wow.
Anyway, they imitated the movies that they saw, and that's kind of how because they couldn't go outside.
Right.
And there were so many of them, all these boys, and they were just like imitating scenes from Batman and stuff and just doing all the voices perfectly, and that was kind of their only escape.
That's not terribly dissimilar. I should check these guys out.
Yeah, you should, because it sounds like you were, if not imitating, at least being inspired by all the comedy albums and writings around you in the home. We
were, and my dad had a reel-to-reel recorder, and we were allowed to play with it, and we used it to make funny tapes.
Just a 2-track.
Yeah, and we did actually, even at that time, needed to bounce some tracks sometimes to do stuff.
You got it.
And we figured all that stuff out, and I actually still have one of those recordings somewhere, but no one but me will ever hear it.
It's getting harder and harder to find a place to play those tapes.
I know. And some writing, too. I was inspired by different things early on, Ogden Nash and those guys. So I started by writing funny poems, actually, which is odd because I've kind of circled back to doing that. But
okay, so What about your other brothers in the Lux brothers? Were they similarly working in entertainment fields? You mentioned your one brother Helmut was doing
He
crew
got
work on movies. You were doing writing. Was everybody kind of in a creative sphere after they got out of high school? And did you guys go to college?
um, only one of us ever finished, and that was the youngest, Rolf. Um, I was kind of spoiled for college because in high school, I was there at a time when they had this experimental program, and the program was, well, we'll let you design one of your courses. So I just took it all the way, and for my last 2 years, I designed all of my courses, and everything I did was my own design, and I had a private tutor, a teacher who gave me an hour a week or whatever, an hour a day, whatever it was that I needed. And
Sounds
so
pretty amazing.
I did, I did my own version of psychology. I didn't have a textbook, but I went and read Freud and Jung and Adler and Maslow and all those guys. And I did the same thing with poetry, and I did the same thing with philosophy and whatever else I was interested in at the time. And I really didn't interact with my fellow students or teachers for the final 2 years of my high school career.
Sounds like an ideal high school experience.
But then what do you do with college? So I looked around and I found a college that was pretty close, actually, North Central College in Naperville. And they had the same program going. So I signed up for that. And I did that for a year, and it was heaven. And then after that, the dean said, well, now you have to do this other stuff. And I said, you know what? I've been doing my own thing for 3 years, and I kind of don't need to do it with you. Which was probably the single stupidest and most arrogant remark and decision I ever made. But I had already become a self-directed learner. And in many ways, I was anyway from the environment I grew up in.
Yeah, and that's really the purpose of college, is to learn how to learn. Because,
Well,
in my opinion, because in high school you basically, and prior, you're just
Yeah.
drilled things and it's all rote. And then they want you to think, once you get to college, and they want you to figure out how to continue learning and enjoy it, which you already had.
Well, and I was an early reader. I made my parents teach me to read before I went to school. So I was already, and in grade school, I would make deals with my teachers if I could prove before class that I could do the homework for the day, that I essentially knew the lesson. They would let me go into the hallway and read my own books.
Wow, so you were kind of making your own rules very early.
Kind of. And frankly, I was so spoiled that by the time college turned on me and didn't want to continue that kind of program, I wasn't ready for it. I deeply regret it. I've tried many times to finish since then, and it's the timing or the finances or the family situation has never been right. So it'll probably, at this point, let's face it, it's probably never going to happen.
Well, yeah, I don't know what you would get out of it at this point.
I don't know. Right now, I'm just hoping someone will give me an honorary degree someday.
At some point, that becomes your only hope.
So, no, we didn't continue academically except for the one who dropped out of the group, which was Rolf. And what we did do was expand our horizons. We hooked up with a 5-state regional Midwestern underground paper called the Prairie Sun, and we wrote a weekly humor column for them. And we would trade off doing that, so it wasn't too onerous to do it. And we discovered that we really liked that, and that we really enjoyed exploring prose humor. And that was kind of the beginning of a commitment to that writer's path for me. And eventually, the publisher collected those into a book, and that got released, and that actually did okay.
That was the one with the David Osmond intro and all that.
Right, and the Gay and Wilson cover, which has got a great drawing of Santa Claus in a flying saucer firing some kind of death ray at something. I think it's the Statue of Liberty.
Wonderful. And what year did that come out?
That was 1980.
Wow.
So, and then the Luchs brothers broke up shortly after that, and I basically abandoned all creative efforts for about a decade. And then I began to hear stirrings of something strange happening in Madison, Wisconsin. And friends of mine started sending me clips from this paper and saying, oh, why don't you check these guys out? What do you maybe you could hook up with them.
Before we get to that, what did you do for 10 years?
I worked publishing jobs in the city.
This is when you were writing for some of those journals and
Right.
stuff like that.
I wasn't doing any creative work whatsoever. I would still write a poem occasionally because that was how I started as a writer. I don't think I mentioned that. But I wasn't trying to publish. And I read a lot. I read thousands and thousands of books on the train. That's all I did. The Onion had a website for about a year at that point, I think.
Something like that.
And when I started submitting, I believe Ben Carlin already had one foot out the door. He was there for like a month, and then he was gone. So it was, you were there, but Rob Siegel was already your lieutenant and was fielding up guys like me.
Yeah.
And he was a very good mentor to me.
He was a great editor.
And it's a great editor, a great string of editors, but worked with him more than anyone initially, and it was just a lot of fun. I found I had missed writing humor. It got me back into it. And then after a couple of years writing, headlines for The Onion, I kept hearing about all my Onion freelancer friends or full-time friends getting jobs in television because The Onion had kind of taken over the position that had been occupied by the National Lampoon magazine, which was, this is where comedy writers are born,
or
but
maybe
not where they die.
Perhaps more the Harvard Lampoon.
Maybe.
Which was kind of the launching point for a lot of comedy careers before The Onion.
Right. So I ended up, I sent stuff out and applied for various TV writing jobs and literally took the first one offered to me, which was politically incorrect at that time. Bill Maher on his ABC gig.
Yeah. So what was that like? And I should back up a second and say it's very interesting that you had this long track with literary humor, very highbrow humor. Didn't really mention Mad or the National Lampoon or anything. And
the Lampoon was
that was
a big influence on me.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was maybe the one, because The Onion, kind of straddles those two worlds of highbrow and low, and that's intentional. We always wanted to reach the widest possible audience, wanted the smart people and the dumb people to like it. But
smart people like dumb jokes too, but only if they're mixed with smart jokes.
But a lot of smart writers don't realize that, and so they only hit they don't do the dumb jokes because they think it's going to alienate, which it doesn't.
It doesn't.
Smart
usually.
People like. But anyway, so The Onion, and then certainly like doing a TV comedy show, are in a very comedy direction. They're in a very mass audience, dare we say, lowbrow direction for you. But you enjoyed it.
I enjoyed it. And I thought The Onion was a very demanding thing to do, even what I was doing, which was just freelance pitching of headlines mostly. I did some stories early on, and that was an interesting process to go through.
And you worked on the paper, and then you worked on the first book, Our Dumb Century, too.
Yeah,
correct?
I think as far as freelancers go, I think I might have been one of the main freelancers on that. But I mean, I guess you'd know better than me. But
yeah, you were prominent. I think David Jaberbaum may have done more writing for that book than you as a freelancer, but you were definitely up there.
And there's a lot of nice things in there. It was a great project to be part of, and that was such a big hit and so captivated the world at the time it was first released that basically anybody within 50 miles of that could get auditioned for any TV comedy writing job.
Right.
And that was wonderful. And I just felt at that time I was enjoying doing it, but I wondered if I could do it full time because the Luchs brothers never had been. Nothing else I had done ever had been. So, and that was a very interesting experience. And I'm grateful to Bill Maher and his head writer, Chris Kelly, who still is his head writer, I believe.
And this is different than the Chris Kelly who worked at the Onion News Network and then SNL.
Yes.
He's an older Chris Kelly, I imagine.
Yeah. And his dad was Sean Kelly of the National Lampoon.
Oh.
So it's in his blood and in his family. And that's why I learned what TV is and how comedy works in TV. And the most interesting thing about it was how hard you work and how little of what you do gets used.
You're basically providing fodder for the host to sift through, to maybe build on.
Well, the two most important tasks at that show at that time were the monologue, and which is usually really it's a very short monologue, only about half a dozen jokes.
Yeah, there couldn't have been a lot of prepared writing ultimately on the show.
Not really, although you'd be amazed how much was done.
Was it for guests or was it all for Bill Maher?
Both.
You wanted to give him one-liners to throw in during conversation, stuff like that.
You know what it really was? It's we're paying you guys and we're doing this monologue and it only has half a dozen jokes in it. And once a week, you all work and collaborate on a sketch, because he did a sketch on whatever day that was. I think it was a Friday.
Okay. I don't remember the sketches.
And they weren't terribly memorable, most of them. But then what are you going to do the rest of the day? We need to justify your existence. I assume this was the thought pattern. So you spend the rest of your time, could be 6 hours a day, writing prep material for the host and the guest that are not seldom used, that are never used. I never saw any of that used, which is just amazing to me. What a strange environment where there's so much production that wasn't even intended for use. What an odd economic model.
Right.
And then I lasted a season on there, and then down the hall at that time, because he was ABC, but he was renting at CBS, down the hall legitimately at CBS was Craig Kilborn, who was doing the Late Late Show for Letterman's company. I don't know if anyone remembers that Craig. He's the one that actually started that program. Yeah, I don't think anyone remembers he started the Daily Show.
No, this is like the 2000s now.
Yeah.
Okay.
And he was down the hall, and it was a much happier set. His writers used to come and tell us, make fun of us because of who we worked for, which was not very kind. But then we'd go hang out with them, and he really liked writers and treated writers well. And it was really a nice guy to work for. And ended up working there, but they let me work freelance, and I went back to Chicago and got another trade publishing gig. I would get up at 3:00, write jokes, then go down to the city and work a job, and I was living on coffee and making more money than God. And
what is Craig Kilborn doing now, by the way?
Nobody knows, and nobody really knows why he retired. I always thought it was because he was a single dad and his kid was a teen, and maybe he needed him. But I don't think he ever even told Letterman, and no one that I knew ever knew. It was a total mystery and a total surprise.
Yeah, because he kind of dropped out of you don't even see him doing public appearances or anything.
I really don't know the story behind it. I think it must have been a personal thing. I know he was a very involved dad, and he was just a nice guy, really a great guy to work for. And that connection led me to get headhunted by what's called a prep sheet for radio, which is a comedy joke sheet called the Complete Sheet.
Yeah, so now we're getting into this whole other area of your career, which is the radio career, which I'm very interested in, because a lot of people don't realize that there are jobs there. But this is an industry, and it's not a dead medium. And it wasn't then.
It's not. It's smaller than it was even at the time I worked there. But most people think that DJs probably make their own stuff up, and sometimes they do, but a lot of times they don't.
So you wrote jokes for morning DJs or any DJ that wanted a joke or whatever?
I did the Complete Sheet for the better part of a year, and it was a huge amount of fun.
Where were they based out of?
They were based in L.A.
Okay, but you were living in Chicago and worked freelance.
Living in Chicago, just, faxing or emailing it in.
Sure. Faxing.
I know. And it was hugely fun. And what I really liked about it was they used most of it. So I just, radio's got a different economic model. They eat the whole buffalo.
And yeah, it's a gaping maw. Like they've got so many minutes to fill.
So it was wonderful to get paid for everything and actually see it get used more. And that led to getting headhunted by the American Comedy Network, which had its own joke sheet, but also did audio bits. They did Weird Al-like song parodies. They did fake commercials. And they
skits that morning DJs could play on their shows and make it seem like they had a bigger team of funny people.
Exactly. Making the morning zoo shows around the country.
And though they were based in Connecticut, is that right?
A suburb of New Haven,
okay.
Milford, Connecticut.
And did you move?
I moved there from Chicago to Connecticut.
Let me back you up 1 second. You mentioned you were headhunted for a couple of these positions. Like, did you get with some sort of headhunting company, or how did that work?
Well,
a lot of people would love to have somebody out there looking for great jobs for them.
In the case of the Complete Sheet, it was that some of the same writers for Kilborn were working for the Complete Sheet, and they knew that I had done. So it was more
of a recommendation, or
but it was without my advanced knowledge. They just pulled me into it, and I was very grateful they did. And then the American Comedy Network knew who was writing for the Complete Sheet. So in both cases, they came, and I ended up there. And turned out that company was not in good shape. It had been run downhill somewhat. They had a bad manager. He imploded after about a year, and then I was the only person in the building who had experience managing a media unit in publishing, so I was running the place in about a year.
And where did you get that experience?
In publishing, I was running magazines, or at the end of it, editorial director running whole stables of magazines.
So you did more than just write back when you were doing the writing for those journals. You were promoted to being in charge of other writers and managing the whole publication.
Editor-in-chief, editor, associate publisher, working with salespeople. That's where I learned to love salespeople, actually.
Yeah. There's a lot to love.
There is a lot to love, and I learned to love it. If you've never worked with a salesperson with Tourette's, it's an amazing experience. I had that experience in publishing. But so there I was, not only writing for and doing some voicing for, but running the enterprise. I turned it around and gave it a new lease on life, and did that for 6 years, and that's probably the most fun I've ever had in my life on a job.
Did you bring your brothers back in to that? Were they interested?
No, they really weren't.
They had their other things going at that point.
Yeah, they were all doing their own thing. I should have mentioned, in between those experiences, somewhere in the mid-'90s, a German punk label came after the Luchs brothers and wanted to reissue Kill Me, I'm Rotten, which had already been bootlegged several times by, there's a famous bootleg series called the Killed by Death series, and we're in that, and a couple other ones. But they wanted to do a legitimate reissue, so we did that. And then they said, well, what else do you have? And so we did a fake live version of Kill Me, I'm Rotten, and we completed an earlier song, which we had never released, called the Hare Krishna Stomp, which was kind of a George Harrison parody coupled with a punk vocal, which was strange, about a phenomenon of Hare Krishnas at airports, which, of course, will be a total mystery to anyone hearing this, who's not at least 40 or 50 years old.
Right.
Anyway, but so the Luchs brothers had kind of a reunion at that point. But
I noticed that a lot of your siblings have very German names. Was your family a recent German immigrant family?
No.
Did you speak German?
Not at all. I mean, we knew the basic commands, of German army lingo, Raus and Achtung. And
Is that the first
Mach
thing
schnell.
they teach the Germans? I didn't know.
Actually, the first movie I saw in a theater was Sink the Bismarck. My dad was a Marine. He was a sharpshooter in Korea. And we were raised Marine fashion. So he was kind of like Mad Men crossed with the Great Santini.
That's great.
So there was a huge amount of profanity in the household and a lot of Marine lingo. We didn't clean the yard. We policed the yard. It was a police action, just like Korea. And he taught us how to shoot an AR-15, and we also learned camouflage markings and silhouette diagrams for both Allied and enemy Axis aircraft, so we could spot in case the Japanese or Germans ever came over here and tried to make trouble again.
So it's just a coincidence that a German company wanted to re-release that song.
I don't. It's an odd thing. I really don't to this day know why they wanted to do it. But he was not an admirer, or he was not a National Socialist or an admirer of Hitler in any other sense, except being an ad man. He admired great propaganda. So he loved the Nazi propaganda machine, the efficiency of it. Leni Riefenstahl films, these great towering posters, the whole totalitarian madness of it.
Their design was great.
And too bad their war plans weren't better. But
well, I think it's great.
I think it's great too. I think we win in the end. But he ended up naming us after both World War I and World War II German war figures.
I see.
I think I was named after some kind of a chemist.
Wow.
Maybe he invented chemical warfare. I'm not sure. One of us is named after a fighter pilot. Again, I'm not sure. I don't know the backstory.
So it was just his interest in that led to those names. That's interesting.
I'm afraid so.
Very interesting.
At least Kurt is not that uncommon of a name. I wouldn't want to be called Helmut.
Yeah, people start asking questions right away.
Right.
With that one. So you get into radio comedy at the American Comedy Network, and you realize you have this other talent, which is like a management turnaround expert.
Yes. And when things kind of kind of reached their limit at American Comedy Network. We had done a lot of things. We ended up syndicating the Onion Radio News, which was an interesting deal.
I remember that.
Cut with the original Onion business manager, which always made everything interesting.
Yes.
How we got that deal was he rejected our original offer and we walked away. Never responded in any way. And 6 months later, he came back and accepted the offer that we had made. So,
what a great strategy.
Yeah, it worked. Anyway, the power of no.
Yeah, it's very powerful in the entertainment business. I keep telling people that. And
It
when
really
when
is.
they use it, they realize how powerful it is.
It really is. And it worked for us anyway. So we were doing that, but I was coming to the end of what I could do there. And I got headhunted again by a company called NRG Media, which had a lot of radio stations in the Midwest. And they also had this small but significant music network running called Waite Radio Networks, which Norm Waite, one of the founders of Gateway Computers, was behind. And it was 15 years old, and it had never made money, ever, not once. And it kept getting passed from owner to owner. They'd own it for 3 or 4 years, and then they'd pass it. I think NRG Media got it literally on the courthouse steps in a bankruptcy auction for like $500,000 or something. And I went and looked at it. It was out in Omaha, and I saw that their work model was wrong and that their advertising model was wrong, and I knew I could turn it around. So they brought me out there, and suddenly I was in the radio management business and out of the comedy business, except as an Onion freelancer. And by that time, I was doing the Big Jewel, too.
So that had started.
Yeah.
Was that started partly because you didn't have an outlet for comedy and you just wanted to have one for yourself?
It was started because I didn't have an outlet for literary humor that I liked. And I was publishing stuff in McSweeney still, and there were other places to go that were good. But I just kind of wanted to have my own thing. And it wasn't even just to publish me, but to publish other writing that I liked that wasn't getting enough attention.
Right.
So I started that in 2002, and that was really only my second year at American Comedy Network. And I kept it going ever since.
So tell us about that website and how it works. You take submissions.
Yes, for the grand price of $0.
It's one of the non-paying websites.
Of which most of them are.
Yeah, no, McSweeney's.
Even McSweeney's doesn't pay.
Yeah, so it's common, but it's great for a beginning writer, I think, to get published somewhere that's legitimate and maybe get some editing.
Yes.
And if going through that whole experience, that process is valuable. And then when they try to get other work, it looks good on their resume and also maybe on their, just for their confidence,
right,
to have done that. Makes them feel like they're getting somewhere. And you've published a lot of people who have gone on to do pretty well, have you not?
I have. A lot of, when I was touring around the Onion a couple of years ago, it seemed like every other person I talked to on the editorial staff was somebody who had contributed to the Big Jewel.
Yeah, they all knew you and were so impressed that you were the Big Jewel guy. I remember that.
Yeah, and I couldn't help but think maybe that's making a bad impression. Who is this guy, and why are our writers working for him for free? Why aren't they working for us for pay? But it was fun. And there's really writers of all ages and all stages of their career. We've got, a lot of people that have written for the New Yorker or McSweeney's or the other places write for us. There's only about a half dozen of them that are really significant, good literary humor sites.
And how did you get it started? Do you know web programming? Did you have a guy? And does it kind of pay for itself? Does it make money? Or how does it all work?
We've had many offers to monetize it. We don't really monetize it. We probably could at some small level, but it just seems like the bother of it and the clutter of it isn't worth what we would get out of it. It's really a cottage industry. It's really done for the love of it. That's obviously why people will do it for free. And it's why we do it. It's me and 5 other editors and a webmaster. We don't have a graphic staff, so it's just pure text. It's a very simple design, which I think for a literary site is a good design.
Yeah.
Simple is better. Austere.
And it's just thebigjewel.com?
Yes.
You know what you should be doing?
What?
You should be hired to bring the National Lampoon back to life, because you're a turnaround guy who has all this writing experience. You love the Lampoon, and they have, like that company that you worked for in Omaha, tried repeatedly, unsuccessfully to turn it around. And it just seems like I mean, I kind of consider it permanently dead at this point. But if they had the right guy, like, would that be an opportunity you'd be interested in? Not that I'm offering it. I'm in no position to offer it. I'm just curious.
It's interesting. For a long time, it was owned by a company run by a guy who I would not be able to work with.
Okay, someone you knew and didn't like.
In fact, when I was at American Comedy Network, we were talking about some collaborative enterprises with them, and that conversation ended with him on the phone in L.A. saying, "You'll never work in this town again."
No, not good.
And I said, "But I'm not working there now." But anyway, it was a short conversation. But the guy who owns it now, I actually know, and we're actually friends. It's a guy named Kent Emmons. Really nice guy, really smart guy, good businessman. We have not had that specific conversation, but I would entertain that conversation if it were made. It's always interesting to me to try to take something that was a good brand and think about how it could be remade or refurbished,
Resuscitated.
brought back to life. And literally, almost no one alive today even remembers that it was a magazine instead of a bunch of Chevy Chase movies.
Did you see the new documentary that just came out about it?
No.
Very good. It's a kind of a celebration, but it just reminds us all, anyone who lived through that era, of just how big a force they were in humor. And a lot of it, I think, is very specific to the time. The kind of growing up with a baby boomer generation and having this overtly over-the-top, shocking, offensive humor that felt really bold and really fresh and really symbolic of kind of how this whole generation was feeling. It would be rough, I think, to do that again. It would have to be a different vibe. It would have to be a different thing, because that sort of we're tired of that sort of humor now. There's too much of it on the internet.
Well, it ruled for a long time, and it influenced the succeeding decades, really right up until the present moment. Its influence is still being felt,
Huge
although
influence.
it's largely unrecognized, and it's through secondary offshoots. I mean, Saturday Night Live is in effect an unofficial National Lampoon program.
That's the big one.
The original writing staff was almost all National Lampoon people.
Yep.
And actually, a lot of the original performers had performed on Radio Dinner, the album, or Lemmings, the album, or the show.
Yeah, and
Christopher Guest, Belushi, Chevy Chase all came from that.
Yep. And when you think of writing, Spy, was a very close relative of the
Yes.
Lampoon. Big influence on The Onion.
Yes.
The Onion, in turn, a big influence on a lot of the other fake news, like The Daily Show and Colbert, that
Yes.
came after. So,
And they're all staffed with ex-Onion people, or
of course.
mostly.
So, the Lampoon, huge, huge, huge in terms of influence. And their work, like when you go back and look at the high school yearbook, I mean, it's brilliant. Some of their work is still spectacular to this day.
It's of the level of the books that you've worked on. It's of the level of Our Dumb Century or Our Dumb World or
America the Book.
the America the Book or the Book of Knowledge.
Yeah, no, it's up there. It's definitely one of the great
And
American works of satire.
it holds up, and it did straddle a couple of worlds. I mean, George W.S. Trow, who's the other person besides Firesign Theater I would describe as a personal mentor, he worked a full-time job at the New Yorker the whole time he was an editor at the National Lampoon. He straddled both those worlds the entire time. And later, Bruce McCall graduated from the Lampoon to the New Yorker.
So what is...
There's been some cross-pollinization, I guess is what I'm saying.
Right.
And oddly, in a way, Jack Handy, who was not a Lampoon guy but was an SNL guy, is now, in my opinion, the best writer for the New Yorker.
Yeah.
Well, him and Ian Fraser, I would say, the two best.
Yeah, they're tops.
Yeah.
So this guy who owns the National Lampoon now, what is he doing with it? Just managing the brand, deciding
He's managing
where
the brand and all of the offshoots, the straight-to-video things, but also things like the bigger movies that were a hit a couple of years ago.
I guess they had a couple. And, they do sell the radio hour still.
Yes.
Probably license that to somebody like Rhino.
Yes.
But
I personally would like to see all of those radio shows released. They haven't been.
Yeah, no, only select ones were re-released, I guess.
There was a CD-ROM that had every issue of the Lampoon on it, which is worth having.
Yeah, definitely. I don't have that. I have the Mad magazine, but I don't have the Lampoon
You
one.
should have the Lampoon.
I know, I should. I was never a Lampoon guy. I was too young for it at the time.
I was probably just about the right age, and it did have a huge impact on me. And there's something to be said for it being, I think, the last high-level comedic effort outside of television that was aimed at a mass audience when there was still a mass audience to be aimed at.
Right. Everything's niche now.
Yeah. And that's, I think your point is well taken. That's one reason, perhaps the main reason, that couldn't happen again in the same way.
It would have to be reinvented. It would have to be maybe more literary or something. Problem is their logo is not a literary logo. It's a very lowbrow logo.
It is. I still like their logo.
It's cute. But anyway, so talk to that guy.
I should.
See what you can do.
Yeah.
Because it's a perfect marriage. Just in listening to you talk, and I'm really excited to hear about so much of your past and your history that I just didn't know about. It seems like it all dovetails so beautifully into and then you know the guy on top of that. It's like, come on, the universe is begging this to happen.
I will. Maybe he'll hear this and take heart.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Well, this has been great talking to you, Kurt. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. This has been the How to Write Funny podcast. I'm Scott Dickers. I want to thank you for listening and remind you that if you enjoy the show, you can help support it for free by just writing a review of it wherever you listen to podcasts.